Hello? Yeah. Well, this is my my name, affiliation. It's so not. Where is the thing to change? So are the contents. I'm going to talk. It's a change of subject now. It's not talking about cessation, but environmental emissions from electronic cigarettes, and to discuss very rapidly experimental results. Then I'm going to talk about distorted risk communication in the scientific literature, and on the way, provide context by comparing with other pollutants, and if there's time, hopefully also for the questions, why is this important? Oh, okay. So aerosols, what's an aerosol? Basically, it's suspended particles, the particulate phase, in a gaseous medium, that's the gas phase. Tobacco smoke and vapor, what we call vapor, are both aerosols, but they're very different aerosols. Okay. Technology, it's okay. So we all know that when you are smoking, for example, there are two sources. There's the mainstream smoke that comes from the mouth of the smoker, the side stream smoke, and the side stream smoke is never absorbed. So it has most of the mass of what is released by the cigarette, and the smoker absorbs most of the inhaled smoke, and the chemistry is highly complex. On the other hand, with vaping, there is only mainstream, and so that means that's a very big difference, besides the fact that the chemistry is much simpler. Okay, so it's a quick summary of the experimental results. Just please forget about the numbers, because there is no time. The cigarette, the box on the cigarette, the box on electronic cigarette and IQOS, there's a lot of stuff in cigarettes, and there is very, very little stuff in environmental emissions from electronic cigarette and IQOS. Because remember, most of what the vapor inhales stays in the body of the vapor, so what is released is very diluted. In the case of the tobacco smoke, it's not so because of the side stream emissions, right? But there are no side stream emissions in electronic cigarettes or in IQOS. What's the matter? No, it's okay. So particles in electronic cigarette are liquid droplets made of propylene glycol, and they evaporate and disperse in less than a minute. On the other hand, with the tobacco smoke, the particles can be either solid or liquid because it's much more complex. Depends on whether they come from the side stream or the mainstream. And also, they do not evaporate. We all know that if I smoke here, the smoke remains for a long time. So it does not evaporate, rather it is dispersed by airflows and gravity. Now here we have the graph on the left. You can see the moment you light a cigarette, there is a large emission of particles. And then these particles, they remain in the atmosphere because they are aging. So there's this process of aging, and this is why it stays, because all these particles and the gas phase are having oxidizing reactions. On the other hand, with the electronic cigarette, the main process, the physical process, is evaporation. They simply evaporate. Now, what happens here, if we look carefully, you have a puff here, and then the particles trigger, even can reach very high values, but then, because of evaporation, they rapidly, in less than a minute, decrease to background levels. Then you have the next puff, and so on. So as you can see, the physics and the chemistry are radically different. Please, the next slide. Now, there is what I want to address is a distorted risk communication. So far, no experimental result with well-designed experiments, because if the experiment is badly designed, you can show that elephants are lizards. But if the experiment is well-designed, then there are no reasons to give for health concerns from environmental emissions from vaping. Yet, when you see the literature, the studies, they say it's horrible, it's dangerous, and emissions are risky and dangerous. Next one, please. For example, here I found a very emblematic example, Protano et al. They did a study on electronic cigarette vapor emissions, and then they say, in their conclusions, legislative interventions to forbid electronic cigarette usage in public places, educational interventions to increase awareness on the threats of use of electronic cigarettes, discourage electronic cigarettes at home to protect the children, urgent to promote healthy lifestyles. Shock. Next, please. So what the hell these authors find that is so worrying? What did they find? Dinosaurs, devils, whatever. All they did was to show that if you have the more recent high-powered devices, you produce more particles in the nanometer scale, right? But the message is, beware of electronic cigarette droplets are dangerous. They go inside of your lungs, they will kill you, they will kill your children, whatever. So is it really true? Let's look at this. Next slide, please. The same group of authors, the same group, did a study on household submicron particle sources of pollution. For example, meat grilling. What happens in meat grilling? You have much higher levels of particles with meat grilling. As you can see in the graph, the blue graph, suddenly you have the stove and the particles trigger, and they behave exactly like the cigarette smoke. Except it's not the same physical process. Here what you have is photochemical aging, but it's an aerosol that is aging, right? And the gas phase contains a lot polycyclic, harmonic, aromatic hydrocarbons, VOX, and all sorts of the fatty acids. And the chemistry is much more complex and much more hazardous. And so we compare this with the electronic cigarette that the same group studied that produced all these shock reactions. And what we have is the pattern that I describe you. It's a pattern where there's a puff, particles rise and go back to the background levels. And if you can see, there is no aging, because basically, if you look at the time scale, at a much larger time scale, they go very rapidly to the background, right? And so, next slide, please. They did the same thing with the burning of citronella candle. Look at the curve, the blue curve. You light the candle, and as long as the candle is burning, you have combustion, and you have very high levels of particles, and you have an aerosol that is aging. Compare with the electronic cigarette. There is no aging, goes back to the background levels. Here are the numbers. Don't worry. It will be on the, you can see it later with more detail after the event. Let's go to the next one. Vacuum cleaners. Horrible. Vacuum cleaners are dangerous. Don't use your vacuum cleaner, please. Why? The particles, they get high levels, 1 order of magnitude larger than the electronic cigarette, except that now the particles are solid particles that contain dust and metal. Compare this with the humble propylene glycol droplets. And then, yeah, we compare with the electronic cigarette. Vacuum cleaners, dangerous, right? Next one, please. So if the number count and long deposition, because these people compute long deposition, it's very easy to compute. There are very established models to compute, to predict different deposition in the respiratory system. If the number count and long deposition of submicron particles make environmental electronic cigarette emissions so dangerous, then emissions from candle lighting, vacuum cleaning, and meat grilling are even more dangerous, because we have more particles with a much more hazardous and complicated chemistry, right? So are these authors, so they're more dangerous, right? So next slide, please. If harsh interventions are needed to protect the public from electronic cigarette submicron particles, then we need even harsher measures to protect the people from candle lighting, from vacuum cleaning, and from meat grilling. So is this what the authors are suggesting? Yeah, the authors should be suggesting this, right? So next slide, please. No. The authors say, and it's the same group of authors, it's not other authors, it's the same group. They're funded by the same agencies, work in same universities, etc. No, we just have to control such emissions by ventilation, or improve your domestic appliances, have better domestic appliances. Dust emissions from vacuum cleaners, use filters. And susceptible population, just warn them. Like I would not take a baby and put him when I'm vacuum cleaning, take the baby and put him there to get all these particles, right? Just plain common sense. Just plain common sense. Why cannot this be applied to electronic cigarettes? Next slide, please. Gotcha. This is a gotcha thing. Because we take the same group of people looking at electronic cigarettes and calling the Marines, calling NATO, calling whatever. And then for other things that are more hazardous, that we do all the time, nothing, just plain common sense. So next one, please. Conclusions. Risk communication. There is no scientific justification to regard electronic emissions, environmental from electronic cigarettes as hazardous. They are comparable. Don't compare them with tobacco. That's overkill. Compare them with other pollutants in smoke-free environments, and they're even lower than that. Because I puff, and it evaporates. In 1 minute, you need an instrument that costs millions of dollars to detect picograms per cubic centimeter. Picograms. 12 zeros after the decimal point, right? With other appliances, you have more pollution, right? So health professionals that communicate risk along an extreme precautional approach that is not based on facts brought by solid scientific practice are violating the basic principles of public health ethics. Next one, please. Conclusions. How do we gauge the risks? Well, there are safety thresholds. There is toxicology. We know thresholds of different pollutants. Now, there's occupational safety thresholds. Okay, they're not sufficiently protective. However, the exposure you have to pollutants is so much below these thresholds, they're very unlikely to be harmful for even vulnerable individuals. In fact, occupational safety thresholds are appropriate to regulate voluntary exposure to healthy adults in indoor spaces, designated indoor spaces, right? Now, next one. To protect them does not require prohibition of vaping here. That's a message. Okay, I agree. To protect pregnant women, babies, and so on, the uncomfortable being in the theater and having a cloud or whatever, that's justifiable. Vaping, I think, it should not be allowed everywhere. But you don't have to forbid it here or here and use them as an excuse, right? So this is what comes from the science. What I'm showing you comes from the science. I'm ready to be scrutinized. I have measures. I have all the data. I'm going to submit a paper on this. Otherwise, claiming otherwise, it's not science. People will claim that. They have the right. It's not science. Politics and ideology. Thank you.